Good evening, everyone. My name is Tanner Barris, and I'm one of the organizers with the Minnesota Cannabis College. Thank you all for virtually joining us this evening for the Legal Cannabis and Social Equity, a panel discussion event hosted by the Minnesota Campaign for Full Legalization and the Minnesota Cannabis College. As the conversation around cannabis legalization in Minnesota changes from an if to a how, it's really critical that we evaluate the social impacts of the decisions that we make in regards to what full legalization looks like. This conversation isn't happening in a vacuum, and as representatives in St. Paul explore legislation to address racial inequities in our state and our nation, it's important that those thoughts continue into the discussion around cannabis. Minnesotans throughout the state continue to call for justice around issues of racial and economic inequities, and the conversation around police and public safety reform is inherently connected to ending the war on drugs. Tonight, we're joined by three cannabis industry experts to explore the connections between legal cannabis and social equity. While our conversation is going to focus on the topic overall, we're also going to look specifically at efforts to legalize cannabis in Minnesota and what those proposals would mean for our state. Before we hear from our panelists, we're going to have a public viewing of an episode of the Patriot Act by Hasan Minhaj. The episode is entitled The Legal Marijuana Industry is Rigged. In this episode, Hasan Minhaj explores how previous efforts to legalize cannabis have gone, specifically focusing on its impacts on the communities most affected by the war on drugs. I also want to mention that neither the Minnesota Cannabis College nor the Minnesota Campaign for Full Legalization are outright endorsing the messages or the jokes of this show. But that being said, we thought it was an important jumping off point for a wider conversation about full legalization and social equity. Let's go ahead and jump into that episode. After viewing this, we will hear from our esteemed panelists, but let's go ahead and jump in here. All right, fabulous. So to our panelists, once you turn your video on, then people should be able to see you. So thank you, Marcus, Jason, and Deshita for your patience as we got back up and running. Thank you to everyone watching this on YouTube Live, on Facebook Live. We went through some fun technical difficulties there. We're gonna go ahead and jump into our panel discussion, looking at the social equity components of the legalization of cannabis. So let's just go ahead and jump in. So as I mentioned before, we're joined today by three cannabis industry experts who each play a role in developing equitable cannabis industries. I'm going to introduce each panelist, but I also want to give everyone an opportunity to share what drew them initially to social equity in cannabis. In other words, what is your why of the work that you do? So I want to first off introduce Marcus. Marcus Harkis is the founding member of the executive director of the Minnesota Campaign for Full Legalization. Through that role, he's worked to activate thousands of Minnesotans seeking a legal and equitable cannabis industry in our state to participate in the democratic process. Marcus has been fighting for full legalization in Minnesota for years and brings with him prior experience working with other organizations in the state, such as Minnesota NORML. Because of the work of Marcus and other activists in Minnesota, we appear to be near the tipping point of legalization, with the House Speaker introducing legislation to legalize the adult use of full legalization cannabis. So Marcus, in a few words, what drew you towards pursuing social equity in cannabis? In other words, what is your why?
Well, thank you for organizing this, Tanner. I have been a consumer for the past 22 years, a cannabis consumer, and I've been a social justice warrior since high school. Consuming cannabis is really the only law that I break. And I've been criminalized a lot, racially profiled a lot, and I've been terrorized a couple of times over cannabis. It wasn't until Colorado and Washington State legalized it that the light came on for me that this was an issue to actually work on. I worked on a variety of issues like education, policy, housing policy, police accountability, economic development, etc. And at that point, I was like, why don't we do that here? Like, why do we have to live like this, creeping around? Or when we are caught, we get criminalized over something that's not a real crime. So I became a member of Minnesota Normal in 2014. Then I was hired and became executive director that summer. And I worked with them until like January of 2016. So during that time, I had the luxury of time to learn about the history of prohibition, to, study legalization as it was unfolding. And I just felt like we needed this here in our state. So, I mean, once I heard hundreds of testimonies from people who had both had their quality of life improved through cannabis consumption or had their lives damaged because of cannabis prohibition, I just couldn't stop. I mean, this personally affects me too, but just to realize that there's hundreds of thousands of people in our state and thousands of people whose lives are severely damaged or ruined, it's a major issue. And yeah, I just can't stop until we legalize it in our state and throughout the world.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing, Marcus. I really appreciate that.
Thank
Next up, I'd love to introduce Jason Ortiz. So Jason has been fighting to end the war on drugs since he first heard the words school to prison pipeline after being arrested for cannabis possession at the age of 16. He's dedicated himself to the cause of justice for communities impacted by over-policing and serves as the president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, which is a 501c6 trade association of entrepreneurs and activists of color. At MCBA, Jason was instrumental in creating model policies regarding equity in the cannabis industry. So Jason, I touched on your history briefly, but if you would explore a little bit further, what's your motivating factor behind pursuing equity in cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, it very much was when I was 16 getting arrested, and feeling handcuffs on my wrists for something that I thought was rather benign. And from that point, I was mad about that. I was mad at police for being so degrading to me, like throughout the process. And so that was the beginning of it. But then as I got a little bit older, I was able to graduate high school and then apply for college. And then when I was accepted to the University of Connecticut, I found another organization called Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And so as a student, I got to see the whole history of the war on drugs and like the timeline of different things that have happened. And then it was activists that changed a very specific piece of law called the Higher Education Act's Federal Aid Elimination Penalty. And it's a very long title for saying we're going to deny you financial aid if you got a weed charge. And so since activists changed that, I was able to access financial aid. And so I was both the recipient of the negative effects of the war on drugs, but also the positive effects of activism. And so they made it very clear that like changing laws and creating programs and making tweaks and moving things around did have real impact on people's lives. And so at that point was when I really got focused on policy, like very specifically, are we drafting our own policies? Who's writing these laws, right? Because when you look at cannabis laws, like who wrote this? And then you have to go to this whole understanding of institutional racism, right? And like why and how. And so it just showed me the power of policy if drafted correctly and, in a positive, negative sense. So from there, I started to see the cannabis industry develop as I was graduating college, and it just was not going the direction that I thought made sense for communities of color. It was actually the Ohio bill where there was only going to be 10 entities that would own the entire thing put into the constitution of the state. And one of those people was like Nick Lachey from 98 Degrees, but 0 people of color, right? So when that bill happened, right? That was clearly a mistake. I did feel like the community came out against that. It was one of the first legalization bills the activist community opposed as kind of an entity, and it failed. It lost, right? And so during all of that is when I got interested in figuring out what's the opposite of Ohio. Like what is the actual grassroots, our people designed bill? And that's when I connected with Shalene Title, who is now the Massachusetts Cannabis Commissioner. And she recruited me to MCBA so we could start to draft model policy to try to figure out what that looks like and pull people together to try to figure out who's done it best so far. And that was back at 2016. And I remember our first policy summit was the weekend after Trump got elected. And so it was like, not what we expected we were going to be going into, and we had to adjust. And it's been one continuous adjustment since then of finding new policies and pushing the envelope, figuring out what we can do in places and what supports other places need, and figuring out how to be a national movement that can support very localized fights all across the country on a constant basis. And so I think if you look at where we're at now compared to where we were in 2016, we are, light years ahead of where we were, but obviously there's a lot of room still to go before we get to where we need to be. So things are progressing. And I think as a movement, we are more, united and more knowledgeable of exactly how to navigate power structures like governments than we were a few years ago, where now it's hard to have any public hearing or something where the equity movement isn't there in force, having a very clear demand of what they want and what we want. And so I'm proud to be a part of that, but we definitely have a lot of room to grow. And I'll be looking, as I'm in Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut will be a hot topic in early 2021. I had the pleasure of testifying before a Jersey committee today, and it was a wild ride of how they want to do things in Jersey. But people did show up, and people were very clear of what they were going to accept and not accept. And, that is something that shows we're going at least in the right direction. We just need to ramp up how we do it and when we do it to factors of many scale, but we're there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for touching on that. So last up we have, but certainly not least, Ms. Deshita Dawson. So Deshita is the Cannabis Program Supervisor for the City of Portland, Oregon. In that role, she oversees the city's adult use and medical cannabis regulatory programs, including managing the Social Equity and Educational Development Initiatives, or the SEED initiative. Deshita is also the founding member of the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, or CRCC, which is a coalition of government officials across the United States who work towards building sustainable cannabis regulatory frameworks designed to deliver on the reparation and restoration potential of cannabis legalization. Along with working to promote an equitable industry in Portland and throughout the country, Deshita is also the author of How to Succeed in the Cannabis Industry, a top-selling workbook for entrepreneurs, contractors, and professionals looking to transition their skills into the legal cannabis industry. So Deshita, thank you so much for joining us tonight. What really drew you towards social equity in cannabis? In other words, what's your why?
Thank you so much, Tanner, for having me. It's good to see Marcus, good to see Jason. My why is a lot of different things. These two are part of it. When you see people hustle and running up a hill literally every single day, but also real talk, I'm originally a girl from Brooklyn, New York. I grew up with friends like Marcus, like Jason, where maybe I wasn't in trouble necessarily because of just what I thought it might bring to my house. But a lot of my young male friends, especially as a baller, they winded up in sometimes ridiculous amounts of trouble for very, very, very small amounts of cannabis. At the same time, my mom and family still used cannabis privately. We never talked about it in a bad way, but we knew that it was illegal. It could cause a lot of trouble. And so more or less, I stayed away from it until about 2012. And I started to recognize that I was having a lot more than just arthritis. So again, I played basketball. I had joint pain, but then I moved to Minnesota to become a senior executive for Target. I was there for 4 years, and I experienced my first negative 20-degree winter situation. After that, my mom was with me. Thankfully, she was there because of Mayo Clinic. She happened to also be going through cancer treatment. And so cannabis was almost as abundant as sugar in more so, because sugar is actually bad for the inflammation she was having and what I was doing. But it became that abundant after she kind of forced me to consume with her, smoke with her. And she was like, you'll feel so much better. I was having insomnia from the pain and the weather and the stress of not knowing what was going on with my body. I had a few really bad flare-ups, and productivity is sort of my love language. If I do a lot and I like to get it done. And when I was feeling sick, I wasn't being as productive in a new role that I really wanted to be kick ass at. And honestly, my mother just saw me suffering and she said, "Child, you need to smoke with me." And at first I was very much like, "No, that's what you do. I get it. Don't worry. We'll make sure you always have it, but I don't have to do it unless I'm maybe on vacation." It was very much her convincing me. And once she did, honestly, it didn't take many times with her before I started to realize that she was absolutely right. And then I went back to what really is what my brain is as a molecular biologist and my training, and I started really experimenting on myself. Now, granted, at the time, medical cannabis was not available in Minnesota. I'm a senior executive, I'm a Black woman at a very big company on the rise, a rising star. And so I was adamant that I didn't have any plugs in Minnesota. I mean, I do in Brooklyn, right? I didn't know nobody. I didn't know Marcus yet. I didn't know nobody, right? And it was a challenge to get enough for what we needed, but I was fortunate to find a friend who was a cross-functional partner in the IT department. His dad was suffering from lung cancer, and he himself was basically buying it from the legacy market, and he was willing to split it with me. And that was like the safest experience that I could, go through. To be honest, I didn't think anything of it. It never made me feel not a second like I need to come out the closet, certainly not to risk my 6-figure income, obviously, and being able to continue the upward trajectory. I did not even tell anyone. I wasn't a social consumer. No one knew. It was really, do I need to go to sleep? And is there enough for that? And how do I wake up in the morning not feeling like the Tin Woman? And so fast forward, I went through a lot of years successfully at Target. They used to call me the Olivia Pope of Target. There's no business problem that I couldn't solve. There are things that I created there that, I'll be honest, I look back, part of using cannabis during that time not only made me better in my body, but it also made me better in my spirit and my mind. At the end of the day, some of the things that we existed at Target didn't exist before I created it. And then I moved to Victoria's Secret as a director, and then eventually moved into a much larger role running a big plus size company website. And my mom unexpectedly died. Like, she had recovered from cancer and then died. And when she did, then things really hit me that I wasn't living in my life's purpose, that I loved my job. I was good at it. I'm very good at, new business development, white space analysis, but the stakes had to be a little bit higher than plus size clothes. No disrespect to plus size, but because I actually changed a lot of women's lives in that too, but it wasn't enough. And I also felt like I was living like at that point, New York, I was living like, a patient slave to the legacy market. My plug moved away, and that literally caused a whole, my hand stopped moving for, I want to say, a week and a half unexpectedly. So it was different flare-ups like that. And eventually I moved to Arizona, where I joined the legal market as a medical patient first and foremost, had my first visit in a dispensary. Coming from Target Victoria's Secret, I knew right away that this was, not the representation that was going to make cannabis more legitimate. And it definitely wasn't making it diverse. And I really struggled. Every person that I worked with, mostly white male of any age, but no people of color really. And I didn't understand while I was on the West Coast that I could be involved in this, and I could also find the medicine that was best for me. But then on the East Coast, it really did feel like I was doing something that was going to be risking my life, especially in New York. No one should have to deal with that. No patient should have to deal with that. And so that's my why. I'm happy to now be on the regulatory side. I've learned a lot in almost 5 years, mostly what Jason said, which is the government does not know what they're doing. They have no cannabis competency generally. And we need more people like myself who understand business and science and equity inside. And that's where CRCC comes into play. We're equity-centered leaders within the government. That's how all policy should be created, to be honest, but it's clearly now the trend, and we're okay to lead that. In fact, we want to be the people that you come to when you need to have that conversation. Because to be truthful, most of our government officials don't know how to have that conversation, equity or the conversation around cannabis.
Fabulous. So thank you so much for sharing that. I love the diverse history that we have on this panel of people who obviously dealt with the law enforcement side of it, but then changed and came around and really are now the business entrepreneurs, the regulators, the activists in our state. So thank you all for sharing that. So tonight, our discussion is going to focus sort of around three main facets, looking at the diversity of the cannabis industry, looking at the connection between expungement and racial justice, and then finally looking at rectifying the harms of the war on drugs, or more correctly, the war on drug users. So I'd like to first start by looking at the diversity in the industry. So looking to states like Florida and Massachusetts, which both have a legal regulatory framework. Those cannabis programs were set up in a way that essentially resulted in rich license holders getting richer. We saw some examples of that throughout the state, but what essentially, to get down to the core of it, can we do in Minnesota to avoid that? How should we set up our regulatory framework? How should we set up our industry to not just benefit the rich license holders, but really to benefit the entire state and the entire industry? So whoever wants to jump in on that first, definitely feel free to jump in.
Can I be real? I mean, honestly, Minnesota needs to fix the medical program first. I do think they need to fully decriminalize and begin the legalization process, but don't rush. We have a direct correlation between how strong the medical program is and how well adult use does. And right now, Minnesota, in my opinion, ranks as one of the lowest on the medical program for a number of reasons. 3 operators, homogeneity within the products, no flower. At the end of the day, it's unfortunately the regulations there and the policies were set up for those 3 monopolies to fail, and they have, one after the other. And so there's very little that Minnesota legislators would be able to do to convince me that adding more canopy to those licenses is going to make the adult use market do better. And it's very little for them, especially now that Oklahoma has launched and now is the number 2 for the total number of patients in the country. They have eclipsed Florida in less than a year. That can tell me that if you cap licenses, that somehow this is going to make the industry better or more equitable. So I would start with, again, because I do think of equity as, globally, patient equity is one of the biggest challenges, and Black and brown folks are patients too. Many of us suffer from urban trauma, PTSD. I know I do. But fix the medical program and allow consumers to actually shop the legal market with more confidence. And also recognize that whether there's criminality associated with it, for the last 40 years, we have not changed usage. The legacy market continues to grow year over year. And it isn't going to be as easy as now it's legal, people are going to transition over. I used to say this all the time in some of my panels, and it's real because I'm talking about Minnesota now, but never before in running any business for Target does any of my consumers have to leave a store and then be worried about, because of their skin color, they may potentially be targeted because they bought a shirt from Target. In order for consumer confidence to really build, we can't feel that fear. And I'll be honest, even though I may have hemp on me, which technically is legal, if you can still smell the terpenes, you still risk being harassed and potentially incarcerated simply because of lack of competency. So I think that's the number one thing I would encourage is, yes, we need to not be arresting anyone for it, but this medical program is nowhere near where it needs to be in penetration of patients and what can be offered in a market. And that needs to be built before any real program is built on the adult use side for success.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Marcus or Jason, either of you want to add on to that at all?
You can take it, Marcus. You're the full legalization. Tell us what you need, man.
Yeah, Marcus, I know the Minnesota campaign for full legalization has focused less on the medical side and more on the adult use side, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we need to do to really fix our medical program.
Honestly, I think Minnesota's medical cannabis program is so fatally flawed that there's no way to fix it unless you start it from scratch. It was designed to fail. We had a prohibitionist governor at the time who was a Democrat. And in Minnesota, the law enforcement lobbies really have a grip on the hearts and minds of most of our legislators. So it's the Sheriff's Association, the Chiefs Association, the County Attorneys Association, and the Peace Officers Association. So they're the reason why our medical cannabis program was so restrictive. Because initially the Senate bill was actually pretty decent, but Somehow we've got to have enough legislators who won't be intimidated by them and won't be, they'll prioritize the people over the police who profit from prohibition. We advocate for full legalization, not because we don't support a medical program, we do, but I just believe that we all deserve safe legal access immediately. As the program is now, you have 20 something thousand people who have access to the program. And because of the limited qualifying conditions, most of these people are low income people who can't even afford the products. So, I mean, at this point, we've seen how legalization in all these forerunner states has failed to produce an equitable model, diverse, inclusive industry. So at this point, I would rather see full decriminalization, just stop arresting people, stop criminalizing, and don't rush ahead with a flawed model for legalization. Just stop arresting us if they're not going to do it right. We don't want prohibition light model in Minnesota. What the legislators can do is listen to advocates who have studied these issues in depth and listen to us, because we know what to do way more than them. I mean, we've been advocating for a craft industry for full legalization in Minnesota, and people like Majority Leader Paul Winkler, they seem to, support that vision. But, once it comes down to moving through the committee process, we have to, counter the influence of the prohibitionist law enforcement lobbies who want this to be as restrictive as possible if it does pass.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'll just say, that it's not a Minnesota-specific issue there of legalization being framed as one thing to one community, and it's meaning in our communities being very different, right? And so if there was one thing, is just slow it all down, right? Because there's no way that when things go super fast, it benefits us. And so we have to take a rather oppositional stance to legalization, even after it's clear it's going to move, but that we won't accept just terrible legalization. And so that's what's been happening in the Northeast, right, where we've had to actually push back on legalization often in order to get a better bargaining position. And so we are now in the Northeast. So New Jersey just had hearings, New York, and they have a relatively strong Black and Latino caucus there that I believe will actually be how the other two states ended up with the details figured out, see what happens in New York. And so Minnesota can take the moment now, right, to, like, as Marcus said, decriminalize, adjust the civil penalties. Hopefully that will help also defund the police inherently, right? Because they now should have less to do, and hopefully they'll be a little bit less strong. But allow that process to happen before implementing full recreation. And so as I've had to debate in Jersey and Connecticut is, we'll wait 4 years for recreation to turn on if you're going to expand the medical program to allow for 4 more cultivators, because in Connecticut, we only have 4 cultivators, and cultivation and manufacturing are combined. And so I suggested, right, that since the state had authorized 10 licenses, but only 4 were given out, give out 6 equity licenses. And they were like, oh, well, that will take so long. I was like, that's fine. It just means we have to have the right timeline, right? If it's going to take years for my community to come online, then it's going to take twice as many years for your community to come on next. And so it's not a can't, right? It's just how fast do you want to do it? And if you want to go fast, well, then make sure my community gets online first and we'll all go faster, right? And so it's figuring out exactly how to position ourselves where our community is winning, speeds up the process for everybody else, but sometimes that's because we'll slow it down if you don't. And that is where I think all communities should be at. Like, this is not going to go down unless it's helpful to us. And that, of course, depends on your relative strength of your legislators of color, right? And that is where things can get a little tricky, because here in Connecticut, for example, it's the Latino caucus members that are often some of the biggest opponents to legalization, equity or not. And so we have a lot of work to do internally with our communities of color. We have a lot of conversations, a lot of intergenerational conversations that need to happen, because our elders are one of the fastest growing segments of consumers, but the legislators still speak as if the elders don't like it or don't use it, right? And so there's all kinds of disconnects going on there that I think activists can help to bridge that gap, right? But The big thing with legalization is very state specific. It's definitely very historically contextualized with, as Dashita said, your medical industry, because there's no place that hasn't tried to flip over immediately. All the medical owners are the first recreational owners, right? They have it literally everywhere that's been attempted or passed. So in order to break that, right, it means that now we have to go back to disrupting the medical scene before we move into this next phase. And that's where, again, in Connecticut, I think that's what we're going to be requesting is equity licenses given out to be on par 50-50. So if there's 4 non-equity, let's get at least 4 equity, or nothing happens, right? The problem there that I would admit that is problematic of this approach is the status quo doesn't really benefit us either. And so delaying has its own, cost and benefit analysis there too. That being said, I do think that the bite of the apple when it happens is going to be so important that I'm willing to wait, at least at this point, to get it right. But there is, of course, cost and benefits with both approaches.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing about that. I think that's really an important part of the discussion that often gets missed when people are talking about legalization. Is sure, we can move forward, we can open up shops, but we already have a legal industry in Minnesota that we're not doing a good job with. We should really be focusing on fixing that. So thank you all for sharing that. I want to just sort of turn a little bit towards actual social equity initiatives and programs that some municipalities and states have looked at, both in the medical and the recreational markets. So there's been initiatives, Dashita, for example, in Portland, that have looked at taking the money from the cannabis industry, either medical or recreational, and using it to really sort of repair the harms of the drug war. Would you mind talking about sort of some of the successes that you've seen from that and what really we should be taking away from it?
Sure. I mean, that's probably how Dr. Rachel Knox got me to Oregon, to be perfectly honest. I'm all about being able to set precedent and prove proof of concept. The East Coast listens to precedent and proof of concept. And so when I testified in New York, because I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, I came back when I heard Governor Cuomo calling it a gateway drug, and then started to really kind of get on the ground and be active. I was using Oregon, this was about 2017 at the time, I was using Oregon as an example while everybody was still talking about California and Colorado. And in fact, I felt like we could talk about Cali and Colorado, what not to do. And as we can see, Colorado just made an equity designation. California's been going back, Governor Newsom's been going back a lot to fix a lot of different things that were problematic. And they kind of set us on the wrong foot. But Oregon, quiet as it's kept, although it doesn't have a really good state equity program, Portland represents about 40% of the state's revenue for cannabis. It's kind of like the New York City to the New York kind of thing. So it can be a little bit of a love-hate. And so taking over that role meant I got to be in an environment that was already, in my opinion, a leading position in the country in terms of what equity could look like. A lot of places think equity really is just about, oh, do you have enough licenses? And I'm still of the mindset, I keep quoting out Oklahoma with 9,000 plus business license and counting, that you can absolutely like kill this cap stuff and just say yes or no. It should be like, can you get a driver's license or no? I don't really think all of this extra stuff is really helping us make better product and better operators. And we can point to MedMen as an example. But I think more or less, when I got to Portland, I saw already that they had laid the groundwork, but it was still steeped in a lot of white supremacy in its thinking. For example, in 2016, the city of Portland, the community decided to vote to take a 3% extra excise tax on the adult use market in order for them to give back to the community. There were 3 stipulations on it. Of course, they always cover public safety because for whatever reason, more cannabis on the streets legally means that police need to be somehow more vigilant or retrained. They also included that this money should be utilized for small businesses and or MWBE businesses. And then the third was that it should be used to we can go back into or reinvest into communities that were most harmed during Prohibition in Oregon, which clearly, without a shadow of doubt, are Black, Indigenous, and Brown Latinx. And so, what happened after that passed, you would think, okay, that's a success. Well, the people don't realize that still 80% of that fund up until this year was being given to the police bureau. And in some ways, I want to say that that is really because they kind of just comped what they do with the general fund. A lot of budgets have worked like that, and I get that. But it's also steeped in sort of the canophobia, white sort of supremacist thinking, over policing, that somehow the same people that have been used to incarcerate and even target and harass folks are getting the money. That felt like a real slap in the face just to hear it. So even though something might be a great idea and it was on paper just great, ballot measure, it didn't get actually implemented well. And that's because we didn't charge anyone with really accountability for it. And so when the Cannabis Policy Oversight Team started to try to make that more accountable, they were still ignored. Literally, somebody had to die in front of millions of people before the council was willing to say, maybe we should divest some of that from the police bureau. And now I was able to be the inheritor of some of that divesting. And now I have $1 million going into the social equity and educational development initiatives. Before that, yes, we had 3 rounds of very small grant funds every year going in some ways trying to ask if we can get some of the money, prove the case. Meanwhile, the police bureau had never once on the record even shown what they'd done with the money. It was supposed to be used for training. They have 16 cops that they say that they trained. And honestly, training why? So, I think we have to, I look at everything with, you can have some successes from a legislative perspective, policy perspective, but if you don't have people behind the government walls actually implementing it with this design, you're still going to have inequitable outcomes. I'm excited about this 1 million, but again, as a businesswoman and knowing that already over $300 million of cannabis tax revenue has come into the state with zero equity, fund, zero re-entry back into our communities. I'm sort of like, we're comparing apples and oranges. This is a drop in the bucket. I'm excited about that movement and that momentum, and I will use it, but this doesn't stop until we see something more substantial. And that's in the way of licensing as well. So we still have some work to do in Oregon, and I'm excited about a statewide cannabis equity bill that we are working on. Jeanette Horton, myself, Dr. Rachel Knox, we are some queens on the chessboard right now, for real, and really trying to work it out. And sometimes it's a requirement to have people in different stations and playing their role. I'm not leading that. I'm so excited to finally be able to be under Jeanette's leadership. Has been awesome, but I can't wait to reveal that, because my hope is we're setting precedent. And then New York, we might have to have some discussion, but I'm gonna lay down that bill and say, hey, this is what we push through. And New York has arrested more people than anyone else, and more Black and brown people than anyone else in the country. So they need to show up when we do it. So that's what I'm in it for, to precedent.
Awesome, thank you. So Jason, in your work with working with essentially minority cannabis business owners, have there been social equity initiatives aside from just equity licensure that you've found that have been helpful towards businesses? For example, like incubator programs or other things sort of along that line?
Yes, I mean, I think what we see in the West Coast and Oakland and the Bay Area, they've set up more empowering programs that are genuinely grounded in empowering the entrepreneurs. And I think that they are successful, right? And so they actually just created a community-owned manufacturing kitchen, right, where different equity applicants can work together to produce products and figure out what they're going to do to get on shelves and, like, creating actual communities of entrepreneurs that can work together. And so I have seen plenty of programs that, when fought for by communities of color, end up successful. What I have seen not be as successful is equity programs designed by white folks that are legislators trying to get a bill passed. And so there have been plenty of times where we thought things were great on paper and did not end up working out for our communities. Things like community benefit agreements in Massachusetts was one that came from good intentions and had been used in other places with big box stores that ended up being used against us in not being able to access proper space, or it really came down to this intense competitive nature of using community benefit agreements and saying only one person is going to get this agreement. And so unless you can provide, we're going to build a whole new baseball stadium, you weren't going to get the local approval to get a license. And so, you know, it's been interesting to make sure as we go that the details and a mutual understanding of what we mean by equity, right, is clear, because there is it's one of those things that when you say like we want justice, right, and like what justice means to my community in this space is very different than what somebody who's not a part of that is going to be, right? So if my community has been damaged and someone says, oh no, don't worry, we're going to fund you plenty, right? Like what plenty means is that $1 million, is it $1 billion? Am I getting land? Am I going to get a house, right? Like there's all kinds of different ways that folks could be thinking about financially, what is this moment going to be for me? And then an implementation ends up being next to nothing. So programming and the people that are running Dashita is exactly correct, right? They need to be funded. And so you can have the best program in the world. If it's not funded, then it won't be successful. And I think that's what we're fighting now is in budgets. And so people can't just have token programming that isn't going to be successful and is set up for failure, like a medical program, right? Had your medical program been fully staffed with 5 equity experts to figure out how to maximize every penny, right? It would be a totally different environment, right? Just having those people there to focus on that be completely different. That's why we have Department of Consumer Protections and consumer protection agencies to make sure that different markets are effectively meeting whatever it is they said they were going to do. If there was promises made in licensure, they hold them accountable to that. But for some reason, when it comes to our communities, like we can't afford the staffing to enforce things. And so I think it comes back to, right, like why we need to be designing and leading these programs and not just accepting that other folks are going to do right by us in implementation later. And that's what happened, you know, in Jersey today. They're like, oh, just trust us, it's going to be fine. But at least now it's like, come on, like nobody actually takes that seriously. And so, you know, we have to, though, come with the alternative. And I think that is where 5 years ago, we couldn't come with such a strong alternative to like, just look at what Dashita's doing in Oregon, or look at what's happening over here, right? Where now we are in there. So programs are getting better, but when it comes to the business side of it, it gets different than in the community investment part, because the amount of funding that a business needs to be successful far, far exceed any kind of taxation support that can help one business owner, right? I don't know if you want to have 100 of them, right? It's just astronomical. So the business supports there almost is really get out of our way and let us do what we need to do. I'll find my own funding if you don't charge me $1 million to apply, right? Like, and so there's lots of ways that the government sets up barriers that for MCBA, most of it is just getting the barriers out of the way. That's where somewhere like Oklahoma or Michigan or Oregon that have relatively lax licensing requirements, you will see more people of color able to do it because they'll do it on their own, right? And so I think when it comes to the licensing and ownership side of it, the best thing Minnesota can do is just make it next to, you know, nothing to get my license and get on board and make sure I'll start paying taxes, whatever it is, and allow me to make a manufacturing facility next to it and whatever it is. I'll meet whatever specific safety requirements you have, right? Like it's not a matter of, I don't want to follow regulation if I want a freer market, right? Regulation is fine if there's an ability and a pathway to meet the market at the end of the day, right? And so for Minnesota, you know, don't overthink it. Just keep it easy for the entrepreneurs to do business, and you'll see people start businesses.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So Marcus, sort of to put you on the hot seat, I do have to say, a lot of the suggestions that we've heard have sort of been what you've been suggesting we do in Minnesota for the past couple of years, which is awesome. Based on sort of what we've heard and also your experience talking to Minnesotans, trying to really change our system, how we have it, what conversations have been happening? What have you been hearing from people in the state? And what can we sort of expect going forward? Not asking you to predict the Capitol, but what can we expect coming out of the Capitol?
Well, the majority of people who care about legalization in terms of the business side, they want to see lower barriers to entry. They want to see real equity in terms of like limiting the number of licenses, like retail. So we don't want big marijuana in Minnesota. That's almost a consensus among most of the people in our state who support legalization on the business side. And that resonates with a lot of our legislators, because the prohibitionists will try to make an equivalency between big tobacco and big marijuana. I mean, the consumers don't want big marijuana either. But what I fear, because there are legislators with good intentions, but they don't usually think about the unintended consequences. So, like, they talk about equity in terms of maybe focusing on certain zip codes and people who've been arrested. But you could be maybe that wealthy white guy that lives in the hood, because you live in that certain zip code. You might be the beneficiary of that type of policy, whereas somebody like me might not get a chance. Just because I haven't been arrested doesn't mean I haven't been a victim of it. So they might be trying to identify people in a certain zip code who've been arrested, but maybe have no interest in getting in the industry. What I'm trying to say is, like, they're trying to make this, they say they want people of color to get opportunities to own legal cannabis businesses, but they're trying to do this in a colorblind manner. And that's just not going to work, and then because they just want to focus on zip codes, they might be excluding some Black people, some business powerhouses like Dashida Dawson's out there, because they might live in Woodbury. I don't know where you live out here, but so, like, I understand, like, we can't require mandates in terms of a percentage of licenses going to Black and brown or Native communities, but we have models like the Minnesota Department of Transportation, where they have these hiring and contracting goals. And that's a way to, get around the how we can't require mandates. So we just need our legislators to think more creatively. And like Dashida and Jason both said, passing a law is one thing, but that's like 25% of the change. Most of the change comes in the implementation and the enforcement. And while our legislators who are leading the way in Minnesota, they are trying to create an equitable industry, these regulatory bodies that they're trying to design really have marginal roles for equity experts. Like, they're maybe proposing to have one person who's an expert on racial equity out of an organization with 18 members. Their voices are going to be drowned out. And it really matters who implements these programs, who regulates these programs. So we have to have a serious emphasis on racial equity among the people who are going to control these programs, issue these licenses. And we need to make sure that, Minnesota regulators of the legal cannabis industry actually try to help make it successful and not, be enemies of the industry.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I want to turn the conversation briefly from the what should we do on the business side to sort of looking at the criminalization of cannabis users currently in the state of Minnesota. So in Minnesota, Black Minnesotans are 5 times more likely to be arrested in our state for cannabis possession. That's despite similar uses across essentially every racial demographic. This isn't a new trend, with racial disparities in enforcement of the drug war going back decades. How should we be using this knowledge as we look to change our laws, both implementing adult use, but also in reforming our medical program? Sort of how can we use this knowledge to inform the decisions we make?
Well, I'll jump in because we're already using that type of stuff. Well, first of all, every time I testify, I make sure every legislator knows that. And I know Marcus does this as well. So like last week in New Jersey, I remind them they're 3.4 times as likely. And we're not talking about 100 years ago. A lot of people like to think that we're talking about slavery or some time that we still haven't gotten really repaired. But we're talking about literally last year. These are the records and these are the numbers. And so in Oregon, we are following a model that's similar in Massachusetts, and it kind of handles what Marcus is talking about. We have enough of a compelling interest government-wise, and I think all of this data and years and decades of it for us to actually name out Black, Indigenous, and Latinx in the legislation, right? Now, granted, there are ways that you can get around the constitutionality and have these or components, but we do need to make sure that Black and brown folks know that we're talking about them specifically. And every other time I feel like we've had this data, you know, shout out to ACLU and DPA, love using it, but it's not jammed down the throat. I'm really, you know, inspired by, again, the momentum that we have. I understand people feel fatigue around what's going on with Black Lives Matter and the like, but, you know, I don't feel fatigued because, one, a couple of reasons. First, one, I'm Black every day, all day, and it doesn't change. And I'm still targeted now based on a smell. And the difference between my, you know, freedom incarceration basically means, did I have enough cannabis or whatever spray I had? And so that has never gone away. But also, too, I feel like it would actually improve the market if we actually took a little bit more of our lessons out of the legacy market and infused it into the legal market. But I think more than anything else, it's sort of this time period where we have a momentum. We're talking about racial equity and racial justice all the time. This started in Minnesota, real talk. And if I was in Minnesota, I would use every opportunity to remind folks that cannabis prohibition has always been roughly half of all drug arrests. Drug arrests is still the #1 reason why most people are incarcerated. And there's a very clear line that we can thread between cannabis prohibition being racially enforced in its racially biased in its enforcement, and the unemployment rate for Black people being 2 times that of white folks for literally the last 40 years, never changed, despite how much reform we've done. And our mortality rate being 1.8 times more likelihood to die than white folks. And every single determinant of health has been impacted by having such a large group of our population incarcerated. Now that we have that, and again, I'm a businesswoman, it's like, if I got to build the business case, this is what I'm doing. I'm building the case with numbers for us to be able to call out the names, use the stats to be able to say, hey, this is why we should be able to first resolve some of these issues. And they're not just issues about whether I own a dispensary. They're issues about disinvestment in a community because it's been ravaged by the war on drug users, if you will, or consumers. Disadvantage still going on because once you've gotten one of those on your record, as the video said, it really does impact every single other area: child protective services, whether you can get a job or employment, whether you can stay in public housing. And so we've got to fix every single part of that, in my opinion, for us to be doing reparative justice. And yes, it does start with, at the very least, this feels like almost like common sense. And that's when I know we're just got legislators who are being obtuse. But if you're saying this is legal now, and I currently have a charge, or I somehow have a sentence that is, including this, that should automatically go away. And it shouldn't be a sweat off my back or money out of my pocket. The state has to repair it. The government has to repair what the government has done. That feels like what I would teach my son. You know what I mean? I don't understand why we don't hold our government responsible. And so last I'll say is that we got momentum, and our momentum going into 2021, the new administration, being able to recognize that there's someone in there that actually understands cannabis legalization and equity components as a sponsor of the MORE Act. I expect all of our government officials, legislators, to act accordingly. I've been joking with everybody that I have like a new model going in 2021. It's like, yo, I'm a Black woman. You can't tell me nothing. I'm going to tell everybody what's really happening. And I think we have to be uncomfortable with it. And either you're going to do like the New Jersey legislators have been doing, completely ignore me, which then gives me license to not vote for you the next time, or you're going to start to fix it because it's now on the record. And it's not, like Jason said, it's not like we're not showing up and sharing this information.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for sharing that. Jason, did you want to jump in at all about that?
Yeah, just quickly on the community investment front, I do have to hop off here shortly for another engagement, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that we need to have an actual accounting of the damage done in order to have a serious conversation about what investment is sufficient. And so I know this is something that in a practical policy sense is next to impossible, and that the number would be so overwhelming that I think people wouldn't even know what to do with it, right? But I do think there are things like economic impact studies. Here in Connecticut, we did have a racial analysis bill that in theory, you can request a racial impact statement on any bill on how it would affect different communities. But the war on drugs has been so pernicious and so invasive in so many different parts of our society that it would be really difficult to quantify all of it. But this is the root of the problem we're having when we talk about community investment and what is sufficient, right? And so if people will say, oh, it's got equity programs, we're going to expunge any crime that happened that you were in possession of 2 grams or less, right? And you're like, well, that's not most of the offenses, right? And so will some say, sure, well, we'll have expungement, we'll have equity, don't worry, it's totally equitable. We're going to expunge possession under half an ounce. And I'm like, what about cultivation and distribution, right? And when we start talking about higher levels or more economic financial crimes, right? These are financial crimes, that the difference between me possessing a gram of cannabis and selling a gram of cannabis can be 10 times the penalty, right? Even if it's the same amount of the plant. And so what we're really being penalized for is making money off of something that somebody else is supposed to be making money off of, right? So for me, there's a real quantifying problem here that we have to have as a community, as a society, that when we say white folks are racist against us with the war on drugs, we don't mean a little bit, right? Like we mean a lot happened there. And that funding from whatever program, be it expungement, whether it be housing support, whatever it is, needs to meet that. And that's the real problem I think we're having right now is folks will admit a wrong was done, but won't admit how serious the damage really was in a paycheck, right? If I was in a court of law and I hurt somebody, say I was drinking and I crashed into some white woman, you know damn well I'm going to be paying a lot of money for her hospital bills, her new car, and whatever other trauma she experienced in the process. I would be paying for that, right? And so when that happens, there's an analysis done, right? So I think states need to start thinking this way. We do have this incredible Regulators of Color coalition that I can't wait to threaten everybody. Yo, we'll call them. They'll come in, because like they know what they're talking and everybody gone through this, right? Like in the regulator standpoint, to really explain both, what we're trying to accomplish in a real way and the how to do it. Because there's a lot of talk about the how. We can talk about programs, but not enough, in my opinion, of like what do we really mean when we say this program is sufficient to heal the damage that is done? And it's tripping up legislators all over the place. New Jersey's making the mistake again of just like throwing it out there and being like, oh, this is going to be good enough, and it's going to get derailed again. And that is the problem with folks that want to take a very light approach and not really dive into the details of it. So in Minnesota, in your communities, start to have more serious conversations of these neighborhoods were affected. They were affected in this significant amount of way, and we need to figure out what programs make the most sense. And as broader communities, we can come to the table with a more serious ask that can actually have that impact that we need. But right now, we're just kind of throwing stuff out there and hoping for the best, where communities on a smaller scale, I think, can start to really quantify things, right? Because I live in Hartford, Connecticut. It's a very poor income neighborhood where I live in, and I like it because there's not as many of those folks that want to bother me and call the cops on me out here. I appreciate being in these spaces more. But 2 blocks up is where the governor and the secretary of state, because it's the capital city, right? And so the capital's like right over there. And so as Marcus said, if you made my neighborhood, an equity zone, it's going to include these folks over here because the differences, the income divides, the racial divides, the educational divides, the health divides are so stark, even with neighbors. And I think that's the bigger question that folks don't want to have to deal with. And that's when we start to account for the war on drugs. You have to account for the educational costs, the health costs, the economic costs, the business costs, right? It goes on and on and on. And that is the foundation of where institutional racism is helping people. And so if we really dig into that, right, like people are worried what happens the day after we start, to dismantle racism in a serious way. And so I just personally think all folks will benefit from that, including poorer white folks that are also caught up in this. And we just have to know that what we're up against is serious. The damage that was done to our communities was drastic. And so we shouldn't accept crumbs or come at this thinking that small programs are going to be sufficient, that we should be asking for more every single time. And thanks to the leadership of folks like Dashida, we can ask for more and bigger and better because they're showing us how to do it already. So, you know, I'm excited to share with the world and all the folks in white suburban Connecticut, all the amazing things that the regulators of color are doing. And the same thing, you know, for Minnesota, let folks know what's happening in Oakland and in Portland and different places around the country.
Awesome.
I do have to hop off. Thank you all again so much, Marcus. Shout out, brother. Stay strong, man. We'll get him eventually. And looking forward to being able to chill with everybody in person someday. So put your mask on so that we can lobby day together soon. Because after the Northeast and New York, DC is going to be a big point of contention for us. So I'll see y'all in the trenches.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason.
So Marcus, sort of to come into the wrap up part of the conversation, and I do not at all want to boil the conversation down because I'm really enjoying hearing all of your thoughts about social equity and legal cannabis. But I'd like to look at what the legislators in Minnesota proposed right at the end of the last session. So Ryan Winkler and the rest of the DFL caucus proposed a bill that would effectively legalize adult use cannabis. Now, along with doing that, it would create a slight expungement program that would automatically expunge possession charges, but wouldn't automatically expunge any felony level charges. And it wouldn't even allow for the expungement of any commercial or sale convictions. Along with all of that, the industry would also be barred for anyone with a prior felony conviction from working in that market until it's been expunged, which, to clarify again, for those with commercial convictions would not at all be allowed. So with that in mind, what do we need to do differently when we move forward in Minnesota?
I mean, those specific reasons alone should be a reason why we have to advocate to kill that bill. I mean, as many good provisions that are in there, and there's a lot of promising things in there. Like, they really were listening to a lot of us and included a lot of good ideas. But that's why we call it a prohibition light bill, because they're going to continue disenfranchising people. They're not going to right the wrongs of this drug war. If you're only expunging petty misdemeanors, but you're not expunging felonies, I mean, you're not redressing the damage that's been done. And to bar people because they have felonies from working in the industry or owning a legal business is ridiculous. I mean, that's just perpetuating the criminalization, the disenfranchisement of something that you're going to allow others to do legally. So you're going to lock people out, for breaking and getting caught over these unjust laws, and we're changing them because they are unjust laws. So why don't you just wipe those records out instead of continuing to push people in the margins?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marcus. So we're just about coming to the end of our panel discussion today. Before we go, I do want to give each of our panelists an opportunity to sort of sound off in case there's anything that they didn't get an opportunity to address, anything they wanted to re-emphasize. Dashida, would you like to go first? Is there anything that you didn't get an opportunity to talk about or that you'd like to dig into a little bit more?
Just to piggyback what Marcus said is that, at times we have to make the tough decision. And I know, especially Black and brown folks, we haven't always wanted to do that. That bill as it stands will not give those people who are 5 times more likely, so there's a lot of Black and brown folks in the state of Minnesota, an opportunity to be in the industry. It's also regressive. And so when regressive bills get passed, all the work that we're doing on the progressive end to set precedent actually still gets set back. At this point, we have multiple states that started off with that same law, Colorado, even California, that have now gone back, and they're trying to figure out how to get those people in through these equity programs. So my hope is to offer, and Marcus knows this already, myself as well as the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition. At the end of the day, I think we formed CRCC so that we could create a set of, in some ways, policy principles that we know have implementation capabilities. Because sometimes you can write something and we know, like the locale, we know between gentrification and the fact that it's still so vague that we're not capturing what we really want to capture. So taking all those learnings and being willing to go on the record, like we've done in New Jersey, we wrote a 7-page memo to support Jessica Gonzalez there because she rang the alarm. They thought they were going to be able to pass an enabling legislation that was stale and regressive. We can't allow for those movements back because all of the work that we've done to push it forward gets in some ways undone. It becomes the thing that the person who's opposing the equity bill in Oregon says, well, Minnesota's doing, I'm like, oh, now you want to do research, right? And so it's important for us to make sure we come prepared. And then last I'll say is, like, we need to lean in on what's happening on the federal level. Because sometimes I feel like, even though I really still think we got a lot to work out, maybe states like Minnesota that only want to do prohibition light bills need to just wait until they stop arresting people, but they need to wait. Maybe federal government will do a better job, if we put those efforts. So I think at the end of the day, for Minnesota, what I'd like to see is to decrease the police interactions, and you can immediately do that by making this not a crime. There should be no reason to smell or what you think is going on, or no one should be calling the cops on someone consuming cannabis. And then from there, expand the medical program because it can be better. And it does mean, yes, those companies are bankrupt anyway, Marcus, to be honest. So they will have to start over regardless. The industry can start over. But in 9 months, Oklahoma has generated $22.5 million just in their business licenses alone, and they've captured 10% of their entire state. That's almost 400,000 patients, and it's a Midwest state. So I think we have an opportunity to show precedent on why you can build something from the ground up, and it still will do better, faster than what Florida's been doing for 4 years. So that being said, I want to thank you so much, Tanner. This has been great. Marcus, thank you so much for all that you do. I watch your lives. I'm inspired by how much hustle you have, brother. Thank you for inviting me to Minnesota. I also look forward to being able to come back home. I was in Woodbury too, but I won't be there again. The police thing, right? Like, I mean, I'm getting stopped going into my own neighborhood. But that being said, I'll be back as soon as we're allowed to, because I have a lot of people there still, and I'm still appalled about what happened this summer. And I think that all those same Black leaders talking about racial justice, if you're not supporting this brother on what we're trying to do, you're not getting it either, and you're not helping. And so I want to also just call them to task and say that we need to, racial justice is cannabis justice at this point, and we need to do better about supporting an equity bill in Minnesota.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tashida. I very, very much appreciate that.
Thank you.
Marcus,
thank you so much, Tashida.
Did you want to sound off anything that you want to quick throw on sort of to wrap up our discussion tonight?
Yeah. So, 2020, beyond COVID, we had this uprising that started in Minneapolis, and spread across the world with the killing of George Floyd. And I've been really encouraged. It feels like we're in a great time of awakening. We're even at the point where it seems like a majority, definitely not all, but a majority of white folks can no longer deny these stark, racial injustices that happen on a daily basis. Like, it's come to light. And I think we have to take this time to, take all the protesting in the streets, and take it to the state legislature, take it to our city councils, because this is a time unlike any other where most of them will at least listen and not try to deny, how destructive structural racism is, especially within law enforcement, especially within the drug war. And legalization of cannabis is the beginning of the end of this drug war. So, I mean, I know a lot of us were discouraged by the election outcomes, and, we're frustrated because we can't put a petition together and give the opportunity for the people to decide to end it in Minnesota. But we can't let our legislators off the hook. We need to really raise some hell. We need to get organized and be vigilant and raise some hell and hold them accountable for being prohibitionists. So, yeah, we need to organize. We're really not going to get it here unless until we build a real powerful movement of the people. I mean, that's how they got medical cannabis passed, is because droves of people were going up to the Capitol, bringing their kids and making legislators cry, Yeah, we have to organize. We can't just depend on the legislators to do this, because they will not do it right. I mean, I've been involved in a lot of equity efforts with like the Department of Transportation. If you bring a group of 40 people to these rooms, we can go from the bottom to the top of the agenda. We can really influence them if we show up. So that's what we have to do.
Awesome.
I mean, with COVID-19, we could do it in other ways, but
totally show up virtually, show up in other ways. Absolutely. Well, Marcus, Deshita, and then also Jason, thank you all so much for joining us tonight for the legal cannabis and social equity discussion. For those looking to learn more, Deshita, about what the work that you're doing, can they follow you on social media, or how can they best find that?
Sure. I'm at Deshita Dawson on the Instagram and Twitter. I can be found my personal page, theweedhead.com. And if you want to find out what's going on in Portland, you can Google Seed Initiatives, Portland, Oregon, and you'll find our page there as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then Marcus,
Deshita's content is so dope. I mean, if you love cannabis, if you love smart, talk about legalization and regulation, you have to follow her. I have her book. I'm one of your biggest fans.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us.
Also, so that's love.
That's awesome.
Love, yeah.
And Marcus, those looking to learn more about the campaign for full legalization, where can they go for that?
Well, we have a website. It's legalizeitmn.com. You can also find us on Facebook, the @ legalizeitmn. Yeah.
Perfect.
And also text MN legal to 420-420. MN legal, one word, to 420-420. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And those looking to learn more about the Minnesota Cannabis College can go to mncannabiscollege.com. And you can follow us, of course, on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, all that lovely social media. We're going to go ahead and sign off for tonight. But once again, Marcus and Deshita, thank you so much. I hope you all have a great rest of your evening. To everyone watching at home, I hope you stay safe, wear a mask, and stay lifted. Have a great rest of your evening, everyone.